Hello and good afternoon from New York City. My name is George Heslin and I serve as Executive Director here at New York Irish Centre. On behalf of the Board of Directors at the Centre, I would like to welcome you to the inaugural American Ireland Youth Conference 2022. For 17 years, the New York Irish Centre has shared its interdisciplinary programmes with the Irish community and beyond. And each year we welcome 20,000 guests to our centre, which is located one stop from Grand Central Station here in New York. As we embark on the inaugural American Ireland Youth Conference, it gives me great pleasure to thank my colleagues Ryan McNally, Hannah Cecil and Stephen Long, who have planned every detail of this three-day event. I would like to welcome and thank participants from 11 colleges and universities across Ireland and the United States. As we emerge from the pandemic, it is even more important that we continue and indeed rebuild the transatlantic conversations that exist between our two great nations. The American Ireland Youth Conference was created to inspire, connect, challenge, unite, engage the next generation of entrepreneurs, thinkers and global leaders. The topics we have chosen to discuss, gender violence, peace and global warming, are crucial, urgent matters of our time. I would like to thank our distinguished moderators, Nisha Varia, Sarah Crow and Claire Byrne, who have worked with some of the most important agencies across the globe tackling these issues daily, including Human Rights Watch, the United Nations, UNICEF, UNESCO and the Green Party Ireland. I would like to thank our media partners, irishcentral.com. We are deeply grateful for the support of the Irish Government and the Department of Foreign Affairs Emigrant Services Programme and the Northern Ireland Bureau, both of whom we thank for supporting and indeed believing in the vision and hope for this annual conference. I invite you to dive into this exhilarating three-day event. In closing, I would like to welcome Consul General of Ireland, New York, Helena Nolan. Thank you and enjoy the conference.
Good morning and welcome everyone participating in this inaugural America-Ireland Youth Conference, Ireland Today 2022. I'm Helena Nolan, Ireland's Consul General here in New York, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this very special event. I've been reading about your programme and I'm struck by the careful thought that has gone into the selection of these topics and issues. Tackling climate change together, understanding conflict and peacemaking efforts, and identifying the causes of gender-based violence. None of these challenges are going to be solved easily or quickly. Only by listening to all perspectives and by sharing best practices will we approach effective responses. And that's where your discussions come in. You're gathered for this conference because of your exceptional expertise and insights. As advocates, researchers and strategists, you're all undertaking important work to identify and promote effective solutions to these problems. This conference offers the hope of synergy, the potential to multiply the impact of your efforts by sharing your experiences and perspectives and by learning from one another. It's also about bringing people together to make connections that will endure well beyond this conference. As our Minister Coveney wrote in his letter of support, these relationships can form the basis for lasting friendships and partnerships between Ireland and the United States for years to come. We count on you as young leaders to build on the Ireland-US partnership as it enters a new phase. That in itself is a valuable and worthy goal, and we count on you to help us to make that a reality. I'd like to acknowledge George Heslin's vision in convening this event and Ryan McNally's work as conference producer. And I want to wish you all the best of luck in your efforts this weekend and to thank everyone involved in making this important inaugural conference a reality. Gwen Sult, Asana Coid, Specialta.
Hello everyone. The Northern Ireland Bureau is delighted to be supporting this inaugural America-Ireland Youth Conference, which is looking at a whole range of really pertinent issues for the young people of today that will affect the future of our planet. It's great that both the North and the South of Ireland are working together on this initiative with American universities, and I would like to pay tribute to George Heslin and the Irish Centre in New York for the particular effort and energy that has gone into the development of this new initiative. I wish you all very well, and I look forward very much to hearing the results of your deliberations. Have a great day. Bye.
Hello, and welcome to Day 3 of the American Ireland Youth Conference 2022. Today's top topic is tackling climate change together. I'd like to introduce today's moderator, who is a politician, a climate campaigner, environmental education specialist, and sustainability consultant for the events industry. She also serves as a member of the Green Party and Dublin City Council in Ireland. She is Parliamentary Assistant for Minister for the Environment in Ireland, Mr. Eamon Ryan. Please welcome today's moderator, Ms. Claire Byrne.
Hello, my name is Claire Byrne, and I am moderating today's session on tackling climate change together. I'd just like to start by saying it's a real privilege to be tuning into here from fairly grey but muggy Dublin at the inaugural American Ireland Youth Conference as part of Ireland Today 2022 and hosted by the New York Irish Centre. And I'd just like to say a huge thanks for inviting me to moderate today's session. So climate change. We know that climate change is the biggest challenge facing mankind today. And decades of inaction by leaders across the globe, ignoring the science, or at least not dealing with it with any sense of urgency required to sort of mitigate the impacts, has meant that at the moment we're now already starting to witness many impacts. And according to the recent IPCC reports, which are a slightly terrifying read, we're fast running out of time to avoid really catastrophic runaway climate change. We're also now under additional pressure due to the war in Ukraine. So we really need to accelerate those climate policies that are starting to come in place at a national and international level. But we know that they are the solution to safeguarding our energy and our food supplies in a really sustainable way. So these are challenging times, but I really feel for the younger people that it's particularly hard for them, as they didn't create this mess. But the impacts will be their very lived experience. And so it's really their future and their children's future that we're trying to fight for now. So while we will look to our leaders and our politicians and our policymakers and legislators to set us on the right path, young people today are not only the next generation who'll inherit the environment, but they're also our beacons of hope. They're the creative innovators, inspiring new ways of delivering on our climate ambitions, and therefore the voice of the youth and how we shape and deliver our climate policy is really critical. And we need them to co-create solutions for the future. We need young people to help design our climate action plans, our legislation, our sectoral policies in a way that's really meaningful and that will actually deliver for young people, because we've let them down and we really owe it to them to safeguard their future. So I'm really excited today to be joined by 4 young students, climate campaigners today, who are using their voices to outline what the climate crisis means to them, but also the important role that they have to play in mitigating and adapting to climate change, and what they're doing in their individual parts of the world to play that part. So we have students here from both sides of the Atlantic, 2 from the United States, 2 here from Ireland, from opposite ends of the country. And I'm really looking forward to hearing what you all have to say today and sharing your experiences and your insights into what we're facing and how we can tackle the climate crisis. So I'm going to start with Yelena, who is tuning in from Oak Park in Chicago. Yelena, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and the great work that you're doing at the moment?
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Claire. So my name is Jelena Collins. I'm a 17-year-old environmentalist from just outside of Chicago. And I've been involved in environmental work for like 3 years now, I think. I started out getting involved in smaller, like local events. I did a lot of film screening work. But as I sort of became more involved in environmentalism and learned more, attended more trainings and workshops, I discovered that this movement is a place where I had really like found my own voice and where I was really interested in continuing to learn more. So I basically just became exponentially more and more involved over the past year or so. I was lucky enough to attend COP26, the UN Climate Conference, over in Scotland back in November. I'm working with my high school right now to produce their climate action plan, and I actually did the same thing for the city of Chicago. I was the only high schooler on their team writing their climate action plan. So I did a lot of legislative work, and I also just organized Chicago's Earth Day rally for climate change, which was an immense workload, but it was really cool to organize and to see it all come together on Earth Day. So thank you for having me.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for joining us today. I mean, it's really, it really warms my heart to see people that are still in second level education committing themselves to that extent, and kind of that sort of really creative approach to communicating the issues and the solutions at the same time as well. So I look forward to hearing more from you as well. I'm going to go up the road now to Tiernan, who is in Belfast. Tiernan, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yes, thank you, Claire. My name's Tiernan, and I'm a second year undergraduate at Queen's University Belfast. I'm actually studying English, which isn't overly related to the environment. But I'm also the current secretary of the Queen's University Politics Society. And I will be again next year. I was just re-elected. And I'm also working with a number of other committees and our own politics committee and a number of other societies in Queens to begin a climate action group in the coming year. We're currently looking at a number of different ways that students and young people in general can help make a difference in climate policy, and also just ways to force the university to take action as well.
Brilliant, and very pleased to hear that you were re-elected to as Secretary of the Politics Society. I think we can get on to that further, but we'll chat later about the important role of politics in the climate fight as well. So thank you, Tiernan. Now, we're going back across the water now to Marissa, who is joining us from Ohio. Marissa, can you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, thank you, Claire. My name is Marissa Kyriakos. I am a second year at Oberlin College, and I'm majoring in environmental studies with a focus on urban sustainability. So I was really drawn to this field because my college is in a very small town in the middle of nowhere. And last year we had all takeout dining for our dining halls. And I thought that it'd be really easy to manage that waste because we know where all of it's coming from. We source it directly from the manufacturers. We know how easily it's recycled. But the town that my college is situated in actually had to stop recycling during the pandemic. So all of our waste was going directly to the landfill. And then once the town started recycling again this past year, my college decided to not opt into the recycling program and just continue directing everything straight to the landfill. And it's brought on this really weird consumerism culture that hasn't been present at our campus before, which is usually full of very environmentally conscious students. And I feel like that has been a trend all across the world during the pandemic because we've gotten very used to single-use plastic and takeaway, all brought on by the pandemic. And even though the pandemic is eventually going to go away, I don't think that this consumerist culture that it's brought is going to go away until we do something to change it.
Okay, great. Thanks a million, Marissa. And you're absolutely right. I mean, we have seen a huge increase in this move towards this like takeaway culture, as you mentioned, as a result of the pandemic, and we're yet to see that sort of reverse backwards in the speed that it needs to. So I look forward to chatting to you more about that later on. And then back now to the other end of the country here, where Maeve is joining us from Cork.
Hi, my name is Maeve Richardson. I am the Communications Engagement Officer in UCC Students' Union. I'm absolutely delighted to be here among such amazing young people, such young activists. I currently co-chair UCC's Green Campus Committee, and UCC is one of the most sustainable universities in the world by the UI Green metric and by the higher education Green metric as well. But as a student in UCC, we recognise that we can still strive to do better. And one thing as a student union we've tried to do is to try to get students back involved in the post-COVID climate. You know, people have social anxiety, and for them, trying to get them back involved in the climate change movement has been a challenge. But inviting students to propose projects such as anaerobic respirators and digesters, or investing in more keep cups for students has been a step forward. I'm also, as of Friday, the new VP for Equality and Citizenship elect for the Union of Students in Ireland. So I'll be continuing to work to make the student movement in Ireland a leader in fighting for climate activism. I'm the former Welfare and Equality Officer of the Irish Second Level Students' Union and was involved the year the Fridays for Future movement joined, and got the Second Level Student Union to back the Fridays for Future movement and ensure that we supported their movement and are continuing to support their movement, second level and third level. I got mostly involved in climate and sustainability as a child. I come from a farming background, and for us that meant, looking at how to be a more sustainable farm, whether that meant putting up more bird houses or just looking after any wildlife that were around the farm and being mindful of the chemicals that we used. And that was my introduction to sustainability, and I'm absolutely delighted to be here once again.
Great, thanks a million, Maeve. I had the pleasure of visiting UCC not that long ago, and we had a tour of the great sustainability initiatives that are taking place down there. So well done on your work. So thanks a million to all of you for joining us today. I suppose just to ask you, each of you, I suppose for me, I graduated from college 23 years ago now, and I studied environmental science. But what inspired me to study that was when I was in fourth year in school, with the only opportunity we had to, other than geography, to really look at environmental issues was on a module in that very specific transition year that we do here in Ireland. And I read James Lovelock's Ages of Gaia, and that's what made me kind of go, oh, okay, we've got to start looking after this planet where it's all connected. We're all part of it. We're all part of this big system. And that's what sort of set me on my path and my journey. So what for each of you, and I'll start with you, Maeve, and I'll work backwards, what sort of sparked your interest in the topic of climate change? I know you mentioned you've been involved in Fridays for Future, but what for you was your sort of kind of wake up moment?
It started for me quite young. I had a teacher who was very into nature and everything like that, and she was explaining to us very early on, the planet is getting warmer and it's not good, so we need to turn the lights off, not waste as much water. And that was impacted by the fact that we had a green flag program in our primary school, and we were able to get involved in the committee, whether we had a position or not. And it was that involvement, that sense of involvement and community for those who wanted to be green, even as young children, really got us all involved. And that meant, it was really indoctrinated into me as a child that this was such an important issue that we had to deal with. And for a lot of us, we stayed involved in green flag programs all through our education. And also, I lived on a farm. I was always very aware of what chemicals we could use, what chemicals we couldn't use, and being mindful of how agriculture can impact the climate. And, we're a dairy and beef farms. Obviously, there is, veganism and everything, but regardless, we've done our best to be as sustainable as possible. And a lot of that for us was wildlife and nature, and making sure that ourselves and our neighbours weren't tearing down hedgerows and putting up, birdhouses, and talking to everyone around us about it. For me, it's about spreading the conversation, and even if that makes people a little uncomfortable, it's very important. So that's where I started out anyway.
Okay, great, thank you. And I suppose it's important, that, as you mentioned, Maeve, the critical role that education has to play in this. And for you, Marissa, what made you go on to study this, and your big interest in waste in particular, and circular economy that you've mentioned?
Yeah, so I actually, as applying to colleges, was undecided, but during the very early part of the pandemic in like March, April, May, we started hearing about all those news reports about how air quality was getting better, or like waste in the ocean was suddenly disappearing. And it's like, it's not a mystery. It's because people stopped doing what they were doing. People stopped producing all this excess waste that they didn't have to do anymore. They were staying inside their houses. Obviously, not a tenable solution for climate change. We can't make everyone stay in their house all the time, but it shows we can make behavioral changes that will slow down, maybe reverse climate change if we're lucky. And these are things that we can put into practice for everyone. I feel like a lot of the talk that happens with climate change in terms of consumerism kind of offloads it onto the consumers. It's about, oh, make sure you don't buy plastic. make sure that you recycle. It doesn't really put any of the weight onto the companies that are producing the plastic in the first place, and also the government for not providing us with the infrastructure to reduce, reuse, and recycle in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd wholeheartedly agree with that. While as everybody does have a very important role to play, it goes from the very macro down to the micro individual. If we're not seeing the change at that top level, it can be quite disheartening from an individual level to feel a little bit powerless in the greater scheme of things. So Tiernan, just on to you then. Can you tell me a little bit about what's first sparked your interest in climate change, and how, because it's not what you're studying, but you're trying to integrate it into your role in the politics society there in Queen's University?
Yeah, I think kind of similarly to Maeve, like I've also kind of always had some concerns around the environment. I think like kind of growing up in our generation, it's something you've seen in the media, like in cartoons, like from your age. But for me, like just, and even as Marissa was saying, there is a lot of focus on personal responsibility, and I think a lot of the time that can lead to kind of feelings of like climate despair. Like you do feel like this kind of individual who can't help themselves, and we all need to make these small changes, which of course is true. But I think like the moment for me that kind of sparked my interest in kind of climate policy was after I started one of my first jobs. I had began working in like a supermarket, and I would say this is probably common enough of people our generation, where I had this big moment of I had to throw out all this food. And we're talking like there was probably about like three, it's a very small shop, and there was probably about like three black bags full of food that were it piled higher than me. And I think just I had a real moment of like this connection between like kind of class issues as well, because like as you're kind of getting rid of all this food, you have customers coming up to you and like kind of lamenting over how this could be given to like those who obviously are less fortunate and stuff. But I also started thinking like how much of this food is just going to go and end up sitting in a landfill, and how much of landfills are actually filled with food that just goes to waste by companies that needlessly produce it. So I had a moment of realization that a lot of climate action does need to be directed at kind of those in positions of power and authority, that are kind of producing a lot of the waste. Just like Marissa said, the plastic waste that is manufactured, and at the end of the day, it doesn't really fall in the consumer's head.
Yeah, completely agree. And I said that it's that sort of that lived experience for you, and seeing directly actually what's happening, and the lack of circularity in all of our systems, but particularly in our food systems at the moment. And I suppose it's probably for you, coming from an agricultural background, is probably more, where there's very you're probably more aware of it as well. So it's really great to see that you're kind of taking that and applying it now to your role in Queen's at the moment as well. So Jelena, for your perspective, and you're still in second level school, what kind of drew you to start getting really involved as a climate activist?
I think I got initially involved kind of coincidentally, I guess, because my friend was joining a local environmental group in my town, and I was like, oh, hey, I'll do it with you. And so I didn't really have any intention of getting as involved in the movement as I am now. But then once I joined that group, I had an opportunity to do a training that's called the Climate Reality Training, which is run by former US Vice President Al Gore. And I was like, hey, that looks cool. So I signed up to do it. And I think that doing that training was what kind of transitioned me into being like having environmentalism be an issue that I was particularly passionate about. Because in that training, I learned about the greenhouse effect. And I'm a very scientific, numbers-minded person. And so once I kind of had that click of understanding the greenhouse effect and seeing how all of us fit into this climate issue scientifically. I was like, hey, I understand what's happening. I understand how all of our actions are having their own consequences. And I understand that this is something that I feel like I have the power to do, to change, I guess. And so, yeah, after that training, I don't know. It was like the greenhouse effect was a very large moment in my life learning about that, because I knew that this was something that I wanted to do more. And it was actually, I had a really cool like full circle moment when I got invited to go to COP26 in Glasgow, and I got to see Al Gore perform his kind of famous like climate speech live. And I don't know, it was really cool having this like full circle. That was how I initially got involved in this work. And that was really like a moment that I knew that I had made it, because I was getting to see it live. So I think that training was what really kind of inspired me to get more involved.
Okay, so it sounds like it's your calling for sure. And and just for yourself, like in terms of next steps, when you go into university, is this kind of an area that you'd like to study, or is where you see your future career? Yeah.
I'm going to McGill University next year in Montreal, and I'm planning to major in math and atmospheric physics. So I'm going to do more of the science side of things because that's what interests me, but also doing the atmospheric physics means that I can hopefully keep learning about climate science. And like, that's a very specific greenhouse effect kind of area, because I don't know why I'm so fascinated by it. So I think that's what I'm going to do, climate science.
That's great to hear. And we definitely need more women doing that as well. So I wish you all the best with that. Okay, great. I think each of you have mentioned COVID and the impact that, I suppose, kind of, on one hand, the kind of negative impacts, as we've touched on, in terms of the increase in the takeaway culture when we were allowed to leave our houses, etc. again, but also the sort of moment of climate reprieve and climate healing that we had, although it was a brief moment, as it turns out, because we have since seen, well, certainly here anyway, our emissions peaked due to people being at home and using their heating more. And, so I suppose it kind of indicates the fine balance that we have in trying to reach our climate targets. And we've also saw this sort of mass mobilization and finances and resources to fight COVID. We really need the climate crisis to be treated in the same way. So do you believe then, in terms of, each of you have talked about the, being up to the individual or the collective to solve climate change? What are your kind of thoughts on that at the moment? Like, when we've seen how governments can come together and corporations even can come together as well in the COVID response, and certainly our health service as well, which will also play a big role in terms of the climate challenge as well. But do you think that at a collective level, are we doing enough at this stage, that governments and individuals are prepared or are doing enough to really combat climate change at this point in time? Would anybody like to come in and answer that in particular? Marissa, I might throw that out to you, because you mentioned about personal responsibility, as did Tiernan, and how sometimes that can be quite disempowering. And Tiernan even mentioned the term climate despair, which I think we all feel from time to time, and that kind of gap that we have in terms of personal responsibility and then what legislators and corporates are doing. What does that mean to you? And do you think that, like, passing legislation and laws by our politicians, will that make a difference?
Yeah, so I do not think that we are doing enough as it is right now. So even specifically with waste, which is what I'm personally interested in, I think something that COVID really showed us was a weakness is our supply chain issues. And with waste, a lot of developed countries just ship their waste out to be sorted. And that's just not a tenable solution. We are not taking care of our waste. We can't call something recyclable if it's not actually being recycled. And a big part of that issue in America is that we have single stream recycling. And that's not how recycling works. You have to sort the plastics, you have to sort the metals, you have to sort the glass if we want things to actually be recycled. And yeah, part of that is on the consumers, like each household should sort their recycling, but we don't have recycling facilities in America that would then take that. The reason that where I'm at right now in Ohio, the reason we don't recycle is because it is more expensive for our college to ship out recycled material than to ship out tons of garbage. And it's just not fiscally responsible for us to do that right now, which is a shame. It should be beneficial for us to be recycling instead of continuously buying plastic to then use to immediately throw out. So I think it goes both ways. It's on the consumer to actually be able to follow the rules a little bit once the rules are there.
Okay, and to have options as well, which we're not really seeing at the moment. Maeve, would you like to come in on that?
Yeah, so if we're going to go with the comparison to COVID, when we were trying to treat COVID, the actual disease and prevent it from what about all the pollution from both individuals and corporations? That's just kind of my view on it. I think it's climate action in corporations and governments in particular has kind of become quite similar to the same way they react to the Pride movement. Great, you have a rainbow flag, but what are you actually doing to make action? Oh, fabulous, you've put up a Pride mural, but you still aren't defending the rights of LGBT parents. Great, all your employees have keep cups, but yet in a developing nation, you still have a factory that, you know, pays its workers badly, is producing, you know, goods in the fast fashion industry. So everything you've done said is meaningless, but I'm glad you got to pull off your PR exercise. And this is apparent in governments and in corporations. And it's hard as individuals to call that out. And we ourselves here in UCC have run eco-grief workshops because it's been so emotionally demanding. And we're starting to see, especially since the IPCC report, that more climate scientists are taking more extreme action because they have to make people uncomfortable in order to try and make governments all over the world actually try to make an impact. It's absolutely disgraceful. I don't think anyone in the world agrees that governments are doing enough because they don't want to invest in these things unless they absolutely have to, even though the moment to do it is now, or even, you know, 20 years ago or 30 years ago or 40 years ago.
Yeah, I know, but I'd also, it's quite sad to think that had we done this 20, 30, 40 years ago, as I said, I graduated 20 odd years ago and thought it was a crisis then, and then watched very, very little happen in the subsequent decades. And now we're sort of in panic mode and everything, you know, the focus has to be on acceleration and implementation. But we can't even do that if we don't have the policy and legislative frameworks in place. So on that, I suppose that, and we talked about the need for individual countries and their own frameworks and action plans, but also the kind of global collective and the need to do that, everybody to work together and ensure that more developed countries are looking after the less developed countries. And because we all have different ways of approaching it. And I suppose it's been one of the kind of key international global frameworks is the Paris Agreement and the UNFCCC and COP talks. Do we think they're worth it? And maybe, Jelena, I might ask you that because you did mention that you were invited to COP26 last year, which on one hand was quite a strong outcome, but then unfortunately last minute was weakened in terms of fossil fuels. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think that this is, you know, that the Paris Agreement is still critical, or is it too little too late?
I think that the general idea of having all of these countries come together to come up with some sort of international agreement for climate change is a really good idea. But it's it's hard because it should work and it just doesn't, because you have the same politicians that are being bought out by fossil fuel companies. And so to have those people be the ones working together to formulate these plans is a little questionable, just because they're not, I don't know, they have their own separate agendas, I guess. And even though these COP conferences are all about climate change, that's the whole point of them, there's so much more going on in the background than just formulating a plan to tackle the climate crisis. So I kind of feel like the way to improve that is to make the conferences like that more accessible. It was really interesting going to COP and seeing how they actually have two separate zones. They have one zone that like kind of less like fancy people can go in. That was more of like a museum area where you can just learn about the climate. And then they have a much more closed off, restricted higher zone where like the politicians are that are formulating these plans. And I was actually in that zone. And even within there, they're like, it's closed door discussions. Like the only people that are actually formulating these plans of the 25,000 people that were at the conference are the tip top world leaders. And so I just think that the formation of those plans needs to be kind of handed over, I guess, to the people who are in the smaller rooms, the people that are talking about the impact that colonialism has had on their countries, or the people that are talking about environmental racism and environmental injustice. Like, it doesn't make sense to have the people who kind of have the most like political privilege be the ones writing these plans, because they're just not approaching them in the right way, I think. So I do think I'm fully in support of having some kind of international agreement. But I just think that it needs to be structured differently, because obviously what we're doing right now doesn't work. I mean, we saw the plan, like the written agreement that was coming out of COP, basically fall apart. It seemed so strong. And then in the last day, like half of it was taken out, basically. So I don't know, it's hard to watch.
Yeah. And I guess this sort of that siloed, firstly, I think all of you should be in. There should be no separation. Everybody should be in the same room. And I say that as a politician myself. But that sort of siloed approach is almost contradictory to what the likes of the Paris Agreement stands for, which is kind of global collaboration. And I guess it's politics that gets in the way at the end. And you're absolutely right. That's sort of what made it kind of collapse at the last hurdle back in November last year. So Tiernan, in that sense for you, as your secretary of the Politics Society, and I suppose just in the recent elections there in Northern Ireland as well, where we had seen, and I am a Green, so I will say this, but where we had seen, I suppose, in a way that, you know, the Green Party had been leading the charge in introducing climate legislation for the first time in Northern Ireland. And yet in the recent elections, the Greens were completely wiped out. So in terms then of the sort of political landscape, Tiernan, for you at the moment in Northern Ireland, and I suppose on a global level as well. Like on one hand, we're seeing, you know, in Australia yesterday, for example, overthrowing the Conservative government, Labour, Greens doing really well, but yet in other countries we're seeing the complete opposite happen. What's your view on the political landscape at the moment, Tiernan, in response to the climate challenge?
Well, I think, you know, Northern Ireland is obviously a very specific case, and you know, probably an outlier in a lot of that, you know, with climate concern. You know, in terms of like the Greens being wiped out in the north, you know, I would say that, you know, that probably has a lot less to do with its actual, you know, climate policy, and, you know, more to do with the prevalence of green and orange politics in the north, you know. I just from experience, you know, and working with the Politics Society, it was a very like, you know, charged political environment, you know, towards the end there. And, you know, especially I was actually I'm in Clare Bailey's constituency. And, you know, I had been able to go up to Stormont once or twice to see some progression on bills that her party had championed. I actually can't recall what one it was now, but, you know, I know that, like, you know, for a party that had only had 2 seats in that last mandate, it had done some incredible work, and not just on climate concerns, but I think that, globally, there's more of a likelihood that we'll see that, success for Green parties. I do think that Northern Ireland is just a very specific case in terms of that type of politics. My only concern would be that in the Republic of Ireland, obviously politics down there seems to be slightly more volatile at the minute than it has been for a number of years. And I suppose that would be, slightly concerning for, you are seeing like kind of climate concerns being pushed to the back for a lot of people, especially now with the cost of living crisis, and just obviously we're just coming out of the pandemic and stuff. So people probably aren't as focused on that as they are on other social issues. But I would say, there's probably some worrying trends in terms of like, I know that, you yourself are Green, but I don't know how well the Greens propping up of Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil has went in terms of young people's support, who the Greens would typically rely upon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, we could probably do a whole session on that separately itself. But I suppose that from your perspective, collectively, I mean, you guys in your youth, is it frustrating for you to see, to watch kind of what's happening and all the great work that you're doing, but yet not really quite convincing governments or corporations in terms of the sense of urgency and the actual crisis and the big shifts that needs to happen very, very rapidly? What does that feel like for you guys? And what do you see as the kind of the pathway to change? Marissa, I might bring you back in on that.
Yeah, for sure. Well, one of the uniquely, I think, American issues is a lot of people in our government don't even believe or recognize that climate change is an issue. Like one of our congressmen brought a snowball into Congress and said, how can there be global warming if I'm still holding a snowball? And that was his argument why climate change doesn't exist. And like when that very base level acknowledgement isn't even happening, no matter what we do, I feel like it's just like talking to a brick wall, especially when I was still in high school and couldn't legally vote. I felt like I had absolutely no power to change anything. And we're the ones who are being left to take care of the earth, right? We're the ones who have to live on it after everyone else dies. So it's just a matter of, I think, shifting. This is why I think we can't only rely on politics to make changes, because it's so slow moving. And there are so many people right now in the American government who just flat out refuse to acknowledge it. We need to start like in like grassroots organization to really start moving people.
Absolutely. And do you feel that that sort of, your kind of two-party system in the States and how volatile that can be? We've seen that swing from side to side over the last few elections. Do you think, I mean, do you trust both sides to like, I suppose for you in the next election, which you will have a vote in, like what will you look for politicians that will fight for climate change?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately with the two-party system, so a lot of the third-party candidates are ones who care a little bit more about climate change, but they just have no real viability to actually become president. They usually receive maybe 1%, 2-3% of the whole vote. I hate to say it, but it's like throwing away a vote, especially with the way that we hold elections in this country, the way that we have the electoral college set up. You have to vote either red or blue. And when most of the people who are climate deniers are in one party, even though I don't agree with everything that the other party does, I do vote for them because it's a very small step to acknowledge the existence of climate change, but it's a step. So even with that, that is the Democratic Party. Joe Biden is still for fracking, which I think is a terrible solution for drilling for oil. Like that is not a realistic solution. That is a band-aid for the issue, you know, but it's just choosing the lesser of two evils, choosing someone who at least acknowledges that the problem exists, and then hopefully we can move forward from there.
Okay, great. And I suppose with much like in corporations, as we're seeing, you know, there's a lot of greenwashing, and there can be greenwashing in politics a lot of the time as well. Maeve, is that something that you see at home at the moment, or?
100%. And just before I get into that, to relate to Marissa, one of our Chocolate Dáil, member of Parliament in Ireland, once stood in the Dáil, our Parliament, and said, only God above controls the weather. Climate change is not an issue, because he couldn't define the difference between climate change and the weather, which was extremely frustrating, and referred to the Irish potato famine in comparison, which was the result of 2 years of bad weather. Not true, it was a fungus, and also possibly British political intervention into our country. But he tried to make that comparison. So we get the extreme political frustration. We may be the Emerald Isle, but we're no saints over here either. But yeah, at home, we do see that greenwashing a lot. And, you know, political parties that have come out, particularly on the left, in Ireland, are used to prop up the more centre-right governments since 2011. And they make their sustainability policies more palatable and greenwash in order to gain power. For example, we have, as well with cost of living, we have reduced rates for young people travelling on public transport, which was great to see championed by Catherine Martin. But we need to push further than, oh, cheaper public transport. Well, in a lot of rural areas, the train only goes twice a day, hence that is useless to us. And that needs to be looked at. It's the lack of long-term thinking and trying to make things palatable. Like, oh, great, we have one element done, but we have another 90 things on our agenda to actually get there. In terms of greenwashing, as well, as we touched on the Paris Climate Agreement earlier, the thing with big international agreements is that, again, they have to be palatable, so every country will sign up to them. I think we as young people and as people with political influence need to use what we have at home to influence our own countries to become the leaders and try to get other countries to copy us. It's great we have these lovely international agreements that acknowledge that there is a problem, but fail to produce action points and, you know, create actual change. And we need to use our position to influence as many people as possible to create actual actions that we can use to try lead and succeed in saving our planet.
Okay, great, thank you for that. Just on that then, I suppose, when we look at, for example, solving the crisis with one international agreement or one piece of legislation, and I suppose I reference in particular the Green New Deal, as we have on a European level and you have on a US level. Do you think that that's the solution, or do we need to be peppering climate action into every single piece of legislation and policy that's passed and agreed at the moment? Jelena, you haven't come in a while. I might ask you that question. And I suppose just in relation to the Green New Deal, something that's just come in for the audience as well is the Green New Deal as good as dead?
I think I find the Green New Deal interesting because in the past couple months, I've done a fair amount of work with Sunrise Chicago, which I'm not sure if you guys have Sunrise in Ireland, but it's kind of like a Fridays for Future-esque organization, and they are huge proponents of the Green New Deal. And so I've heard a lot of like big pro Green New Deal sort of speeches lately. And I mean, obviously I support the Green New Deal because I think that we need radical climate legislation, but I really agree with what you mentioned earlier, Claire, that I think we do need to take a climate lens and use it for every other kind of legislation that we're passing. I think that, I don't know, it's like politics doesn't grasp the severity of this issue, but they really need to. And climate needs to be on some kind of like checklist before we pass any piece of legislation that's like, is this policy sustainable and is it going to better the planet? Because I don't know, we have like 5 years to turn ourselves around. Like, I don't understand why nobody's grasping how urgently we need to solve this crisis. But the climate needs to be something that we're taking into account in every decision that we make, political or otherwise. So the Green New Deal is great, but it's not enough, because everything else that we pass also needs to take into account and actively better the climate if we're going to turn this all around in time.
Yeah, and that's it. Every decision, every infrastructure decision, every investment decision, every budgetary decision has to have that climate lens, as you said, and make sure it's in line with our national and international climate targets. So just another question actually that's come in, and I'll go to either Tiernan, or Maeve on this, because it's directly asking about the situation in Ireland at the moment. And the question is climate change more apparent in Irish low-income communities like it is in the US? Would either of you like to answer that question? Maeve, are you nodding?
Yeah, I think it might be helpful for both of us to give our perspectives. Because
yeah, that'd be great. Thanks.
There is differing situations between down here in the north,
yeah.
And I think it is the same globally that yes, low-income people are more affected by, climate problems, because they have to make decisions that might not, because of the financial situation of a low-income family, they might not be able to invest in what might be more sustainable. If you have to buy your shoes from a sort of store that sells shoes for €3 to €4, you have to make that decision because of your financial situation. While if you had more money, you could have a longer lasting pair of shoes that won't, go break down within a month or two. You can invest in having shoes that cost €200 and will last you years. And you have to keep making those decisions because of your financial situation. And having supports to make, homes more sustainable and things are starting to come into place, or helping people invest in having electric cars is what we need to start doing. We need to start incentivizing making good decisions, but also, giving people a leg up and not punishing them for being in a worsening financial situation. That's all I kind of have to say on that. It is just so apparent that you're being left behind if you're of a lower class or of lower income, because that is just how the capitalist system works. The consumerist culture is feeding into that we are able to access more products, and if you have less income, you're able to access them, but they're not good quality and are probably going to landfill because they're breaking down.
Yeah, no, and they're very, very difficult decisions for people, individuals, families to make, particularly at the moment. And, we do know that stuff accounts for about 45% of our overall emissions, yet there is that sort of, sustainability costs and, I suppose changing our behaviors and attitudes towards secondhand goods and reusing goods and all that. Like, we have a huge piece of work to do around that at the moment. Tiernan, you might want to give your perspective on whether low income, those on the lower decile are more severely impacted by climate change.
Yeah, I agree completely with Maeve. I think that it's quite clear that, a lot of media attention, and I think, even the whole fixation with personal responsibility and, this idea of we all have this kind of equal and shared amount of responsibility does clearly hit lower income people hardest, because, people obviously, especially now, just with the cost of living crisis, don't really have those choices, and it's ironic considering that, it is the people with who actually, you know, control the means of distribution and both production, are the ones who are generating this climate crisis, you know. And it's just as you said earlier, you know, how you had said, like, it really is, climate change is something that we should, you know, it affects every facet of life and society, you know. Like, there's so much that, you know, we could be doing that doesn't inhibit the lives of working class people, and also targets the problem, you know. Things like, you know, free public transport would greatly assist working class families, and also reduce the amount of cars on the road, you know. Like, there's no reason that public transport as well can't be completely green, you know. We talk a lot about how the kind of shame of having like a car that isn't electric, but, you know, if those cars are running on roads that are made the way we make them today, that doesn't matter, because the amount of CO2 that's released during like the maintenance and creation of roads is, you know, more than actually that the traffic on them produces. You know, there's the problems of climate change run right to the core of society, and, you know, it really is that the people in power who, you know, have to, I suppose, deal with it. You know, that's not to say that we don't have personal responsibility. You know, a lot of like, I think climate action should be, again, like from the bottom up. You know, it should be it. I suppose when I say personal responsibility in climate change, I think that means, you know, working class people bringing those kind of in power to account, you know, holding them to account, and kind of ending this, you know, system of, you know, it really, because it really is, you know, a matter of the distribution of everything, you know, is like, we have an excess of food, you know. There are places in the developing world where there's like food scarcity. You know, how much of our food will go into those what do you call it, to the dumps and everything, and, you know, sit there and rot, and then, you know, just contribute to the climate crisis. You know, there is a way to live sustainably, but I don't think it's really being helped by the system that we currently live under.
Yeah, I'd wholeheartedly agree. And I guess it kind of goes back to what we were saying earlier about the need to, you know, include climate action in every single policy decision that's made across the board, and to ensure that measures aren't punitive, to make sure that equality is at the heart of it as well, to make sure that they're economically and socially just. You know, and that goes at all levels. That goes within our own countries, and then also in the developing countries, as you mentioned, Tiernan, as well, which are already the hardest hit and will continue to be the hardest hit, yet they've been the least contributors to this crisis. So I have another question, which was one I had myself, but also one, it's a similar one has come in from the audience as well. And so each of you are climate activists, and you know, you're each in your own individual way, I believe, just even from reading your bios and talking to you today, contributing hugely to climate action, and, you know, a really positive input into the pathway that we need to create to avoid catastrophic climate change. But then there's also the very extreme end of activism as well. And I know, Jelena, you talked about your, you know, your community involvement, which is hugely important to this kind of screenings and events. And that's kind of my background as well. And, you know, creating those sort of really interactive and creative platforms for people to engage in the issues. But do you think that groups like Extinction Rebellion and PETA, or my new favorite one, which is Insulate Britain, which just gives me visions of guerrilla retrofitters going into people's houses, which I think sounds really exciting. But do you think that those, like, is there a role for that sort of extreme activism, given we're in a very extreme time, and, you know, as you said, we're running out of time and it requires an extreme response? But do you think that sort of extreme activism is beneficial, or do you think that it's alienating some citizens? Jelena, I might ask you to come in on that, and obviously anyone else wants to come in, you're more than welcome.
That's a really interesting question. I for me personally, I don't think that I'm one for hyper radical activism. I don't know. I just don't think it's for me. I feel like there's a place for it, but I think that it's a very specific place, because I don't think that the way to get things done is by, I like the word alienating, by alienating or even like disrespecting the people in power, because I don't think that that makes them any more inclined to take the actions that you want them to take. And so I don't know, it's so hard. I think that it has to be done in the right way, and I don't even know what the right way is, but I feel like it can be risky to take super radical actions like that, only because there's like a weird like personal kind of emotional factor that plays into radical activism like that, that isn't as present in more moderate activism. And I think you have to remember that the people making these decisions are humans with emotions, and they're so used to being on this pedestal because they've been elected to these positions of power or appointed or whatever, and they're used to being very like respected, and having people kind of bow down to them. And so I feel like their egos are possibly more likely to be damaged by people like yelling at them or interrupting their speeches or whatever it may be. So I don't know. I feel like radical action can be very inspiring, but I think it just depends how you do it.
Yeah, I think we probably need a bit of both, though. It's good radical activism to get some people thinking as well. But Maeve, you want to come in there, do you?
Yeah, I think there's a place for radical activism as well. I think every good organization or drive for change kind of needs the three strands: the radical activists, the palatable activists, and then those who are sympathetic from the general public. And it's trying to create, conversations between them, because they're trying to generally achieve the same goal, but it's how you achieve it. Now, if we take the example of Extinction Rebellion, started out quite good. Now the problem is some of the actions that they took weren't helpful to the general public, such as blocking traffic, which creates more traffic and more pollution. And if I'm a student who's trying to get to college on time, I'm going to not like you afterwards. But again, we do have to make people uncomfortable to make change. And I think sometimes if you get the right bit of radical action, it is what changes the general public's opinion and grabs their attention. So whether that is projecting something onto a building, explaining how bad the climate crisis is, or if we saw, for the example yesterday of An Lá Darg for Dream Darg for Irish language rights in the north, doing big, they had their symbol up on a mountain outside Belfast, showing how many people contributed to making this big flag and how many people were interested, and that could be considered radical activism. And it's what shows that there's people behind it. And it's just striking the balance between what's radical and will actually get the attention of people, but won't, offend their daily lives and, everything like that. There's always the people who are, youth activists who end up, making posters and getting more people involved. And then there's the general public who are kind of half in there, but wouldn't attempt to strike. It's trying to get them all together. I think there's so many examples of situations like that. Now, the situation that I've described, the kind of three-strand approach, usually works better on a local level, but if there's a way of striking on a national level between all sort of coalition partners of activism organizations, trade unions, student unions, to figure out how to do this correctly, I think that's how we could strike real change.
Okay, great. And certainly, I suppose that's sort of, I suppose one of the most sort of palatable campaigns I feel is Fridays for Future, and and it was so inspiring to see so many people hit the streets. And then unfortunately COVID has kind of scuppered that, and so now we're entering into a kind of different type and phase of activism, Marissa. And I'm coming to you, sorry. And I suppose, social media plays a really big role in that as well, and can be very positive, but can also be very negative as well. You might talk about your experience as an activist and the type of activism that we need in a post-COVID world, but also in a very social media dependent world. But
yeah, I feel like a lot of the problem with activism, and I speak of this just because my campus is very, people like to say they're very socially conscious, but it is a predominantly white institution, and it is in the Midwest of America. It is a very specific type of people who make up the majority of the population here. And I feel like a lot of the issue is that they don't consider the intersectionality of issues. And so by doing that, you're just immediately alienating a big chunk of the people, usually the people who are most affected by the issue that you are trying to bring attention to and trying to solve. And I feel like social media can be a really powerful tool to communicate these issues and reach a wider audience, and also talk about issues that people don't really know about, and not only issues, but just like cultures that people don't know about. So a lot of the radical activism that I see in America is with veganism and animal rights in that sense. And one of the more disheartening things that I've seen from activism is targeting Indigenous groups over their use of fur and their use of just killing animals, but they're not contributing to the problem of climate change. They're not practicing animal cruelty. They're practicing their indigenous cultures and traditions in a humane, ethical way. They use all parts of the animals. They respect them. They don't hunt them to extinction. And so I feel like that's really the big issue that I have with radical activist groups, is when they ignore the intersectionality of issues and go after groups that are actually helping the issue instead.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. Actually, I never really considered that before. Like targeting the sort of minority groups is absolutely not the solution, and that's really not the way to bring people with us at all. And we need everybody with us on this journey. Tiernan, from your perspective in terms of activism, and I suppose for me, I always feel that there's no, and it is changing a little bit now, but in a time of social media and social influencers are so important, I really struggle to see anybody that, anyone in the sort of high level social influencers or celebrities really coming out and being a voice to reach out to a certain cohort of the population. But we know that stuff sells. I mean, it sells goods, it sells all the stuff that we don't need, that contributes to climate change. But we also have to do the same. It has to be that level of advertising in order to kind of hammer home this message. Tiernan, have you any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think, the issue, it's really difficult because, just like everyone mentioned there is kind of like an image that needs to be maintained, to try to pull people in your direction. And, I do think social media and stuff will play a part in that. But like at the end of the day, this is like a global issue that's going to affect everyone. It's also like a class-based issue. And I think, the only way that any viable solution is going to come to the climate crisis is going to be a grassroots, community-led campaign around the world. Like, I don't think, we'd said there, you mentioned a few groups who have been involved in like radical climate activism. I don't think those groups are radical, and I don't think that we have really seen radical climate activism yet, because when dealing with a crisis of this scale that we have never seen before, I don't think it's possible to be too radical. There's a lot of talk of like inconveniencing people and stuff, and of course that like isn't going to win many people over to your side. And I've also been disrupted on my way to places like because of protests, and it doesn't necessarily endear you. But I think that a lot of the radical climate action is going to come in the form of direct action, and intentionally targeting those who are doing the damage. You know what I mean? Those who do kind of uphold the systems that allow this to take place, and those who will not suffer, won't suffer first or the brunt of the damage that comes from the climate crisis.
Yeah, absolutely. There's one other comment, I suppose, just that's come in response to what Marissa or what May was saying. Sorry, Marissa was saying. Is in relation to in Ireland here, we're introducing a ban on turf sales, and this is in follow on to a kind of a wider diversification that's happening in our bogs in terms, Bord na Móna, one of our biggest peat producers, which is obviously a huge emitter, is now, is completely diversifying their business in a very socially just way. And focusing more on re-wetting bogs and bringing them back to nature, which is a good example. It's a slow process, but it's a good example of what's possible and what can happen. But at the same time, the further law banning turf sales is in relation to air quality and preventing the kind of 1,300 deaths a year that happen as a result of our poor air quality, which is from a number of things, but smoky fuels is a huge contributor to that. But then there is the problem of, that potentially isolating people in rural Ireland. And again, I suppose it just goes back to that point of the very, very fine balance and that great word that Marissa used, the intersectionality that's needed in terms of all our policies and all our legislation across the board. And I suppose on that point, because we're well over the hour now, and so we might start to wrap things up. And I might ask each of you we've talked a lot. We've just talked about radical action, palatable action, sympathetic action, and I suppose overall the need for more action on whatever level, be that in a disruptive way or from a, from the political perspective, legislation perspective, policy perspective, right down to the end, the corporate perspective, the individual perspective. We've talked about the need for climate lens to be applied at every level, at all decisions. We've talked about social media being a really, really powerful tool. And we've also touched a lot, each of you have mentioned terms like eco grief and climate despair and feeling powerless in this fight and in this challenge. And yet each of you are also very aware of not just the gaps and the failures, but also the solutions. And I suppose just to wrap up, I'd love to get just like even just 1 minute from each of you on what you'd love to see change and what you really feel needs to change in the immediate, well, I suppose in the immediate, medium and long term, in order for you to feel heard and feel understood and feel that the right people are responding to your needs. And I suppose ultimately for you to feel safe and that your future is safe and that the planet is safe and that we're in good hands, and that we are kind of tackling this collectively. So I'll just go backwards, and Tiernan, I might just finish with you. So just 1 minute on your vision for genuine climate action.
Yeah, I think, just for me, one of the, I suppose, key things to look out for would be a kind of reorganization and, kind of refocus of society onto, building a world where the main driving force for everything in the world isn't just money or profit or, consumption to the highest degree, but instead, organizing around the needs of people. And just by doing that, we will see like a massive reduction in waste. We will see that like that kind of suffering that comes from climate change won't be so hard hitting of the working class. And I think that probably the main takeaway from it all is like the most important thing to do is just to organize. It's to organize with the people in your community, and it starts with grassroots movements.
Great, thank you. Jelena, I might let you in.
I think that for me to feel good about the climate crisis, I guess, would mean to have really strong legislation passed with really strong frameworks for accountability to go with it. Because that's a big part of passing climate legislation, is to have some sort of follow-up system, to have like measurements and tracking to make sure that we are actually accomplishing the goals that we've set for ourselves. But I also think that it would be really nice to see like a larger societal shift toward what I was saying earlier, like kind of just looking at everything through a climate lens. I think that not enough people are extremely aware of the climate. I think that there are a lot of people who think about the climate occasionally and who recognize that climate change is an issue, but they don't take the additional step of like really factoring it into their decisions. And so I think that that's the kind of bottom up change that we need to see, is for every person to just factor in climate change when they are making any kind of decision, whether it's like their transportation, their job, how they're spending their money. I think that if we all start looking at things through a climate lens, that's kind of the societal like mindset shift that we need to go through.
Yeah, which is challenging, but not impossible, I think. Maeve?
For me, I also agree with Tiernan and Jelena on the comments they've made. I think everything we say here is probably what should be implemented. For me, it goes back to education and re-educating people on what is the problem here. And, even though I did my activism came from being involved in green schools and green flag program as a young person, the discussion hadn't developed as far as, beyond turning off your leaky tap and not littering, while we do need in every level of education and outside of the education system for lifelong learning, it's to discuss how it is corporations and governments making consecutive decisions that are harming our planet. That's what we need to do. We need to start calling people into account, and bringing that into the education system, outside of the education system, I think is the one change I would want to see in order for us to actually vocalize and fight for what is right to save ourselves as people. And I think sometimes climate activism gets painted as nearly a selfish thing, that we have some sort of an agenda that isn't just saving the planet. But the fact is that climate activists aren't looking for something for themselves. They're trying to get the best out of life for its people and its planet, not just for ourselves, but for absolutely everyone. And I hate to see how that's being painted, and how people have been educated around climate activism. Like, people have said, oh, Greta Thunberg, what a great example, a young person taking the lead. But people don't hear her screaming out saying, it is the corporations, stop looking at me as a poster child, please, please, please. And it's reframing that entire discussion within our education system.
Yeah, and actually I would also say making sure that it transcends into third level as well, because very often with those programs we kind of see great primary school, not so great secondary school, and then by third level, unless we have people like yourselves, it kind of, people start to lose interest, in the kind of level of activism kind of nosedives a little bit. Marissa, your closing remarks, please.
Yeah, I completely agree with everyone, but especially what you were just saying. I think that the biggest step forward that I'd love to see is for corporations to be accountable. They need to be held accountable for their emissions. They're the ones producing the majority of emissions. We've moved past the point of cap and trade being a good way to keep track of emissions. We've moved past wetland mitigation. We've moved past like turning in scanning your bottle caps to earn points to prove that you've recycled. You know, they just need to be held accountable for producing the waste. They're the ones generating the waste. They're the ones generating the emissions. That's what we need to be focusing on.
Yeah, absolutely. And while you paint you paint a grim picture on one hand, but yet, as I said, each of you are very, very clear on the solutions, on how we need to go forward, and what, you know, so the solutions are there. We know what needs to be done, but there has to be that kind of political will. There has to be individual will, or at the very least individuals to feel educated and empowered, and for it to be made very easy for them to make this shift that we know has many, many co-benefits to it as well, in terms of healthier lifestyles, cleaner, greener environments, and as well as obviously staving off the threat of catastrophic climate change as well. So while we can often feel quite despairing, I guess today for me has brought me an awful lot of hope. And I have found each of your contributions incredibly inspiring. It's given me a lot of hope for the future. I hope that each of you choose careers that will really help contribute to the fight against climate change. And I think each of you have really bright futures and very bright green careers ahead of you. So I want to say thanks to each of you. Jelena had to leave because she was off to chair a meeting, I think. So I would say thanks to Jelena, to Tiernan, Marissa and May for your unbelievable insights and incredible contributions this evening. I'm going to bring the session to a close now. Thank you to all the delegates, or everyone who tuned in tonight, and also to all the delegates who took part in the conference over the weekend. Congratulations on being part of this. Thank you to everyone at the New York Irish Centre. For me in particular, George, Ryan, Hannah and Zach, who were really helpful in pulling everything together and incredibly communicative with each of us that were taking part. So thank you to everyone for tuning in. I hope that your takeaway from this evening is inspiring in the same way that it has been for me, that our young people, while they may be the most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, they are undoubtedly a critical part of the solution. So thanks for tuning in. Thanks to everyone over the course of the last few days and for taking part. If you missed any of the other panels, you can catch them up on the NewYorkIrishCentre.org website or on YouTube. All 3 days conference sessions will be available to watch back. So thank you everyone for tuning in tonight, and thanks again to all the panelists. I really hope our paths cross again in the future. Thank you.